For more of me, head on over to Twitch at twitch.tv/Big D Geekdom 101, where I provide exclusive streams that you will not see here on YouTube and bonus content for y'all to check out, including old video games, anime, and a heck of a lot more. Twitch.tv/Big D Geekdom 101. I'll see you there. So on this edition of Video Game Memories, I thought I'd take a look back, a trip down memory lane, so to speak, back to the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, and the early days of emulation. So when I was a kid, I had collected a huge amount of video game magazines, which I still have to this day. I love reading video game magazines. I was totally into video games, but the only problem was that we were poor. I had a Super Nintendo, I had a Nintendo, and at one time I had a Sega Genesis with a Sega CD and 32X. And I had a few games, but there were other things I wanted that we could never afford. Like there were games I could never play. There were systems that I always wanted to get that we couldn't afford. I wanted to get stuff like the 3DO and the Sega Saturn. I never got one, even though in some ways I'm glad I didn't. You know what I'm saying? Because some of those systems, especially 3DO, wound up being a big flop. You read these game magazines and you start to dream about what it would be like to play these games, but you can't afford it. We grew up poor. And so I was blessed enough to have a few games, but I didn't have every game. So when I started finding out about emulators and ROMs, it was when I was in early high school. I want to say freshman year. And that's when sort of the piracy world began, so to speak. There were kids that were selling bootleg movies that were still in theaters. That was my first time ever being exposed to like a cam movie. There were kids that had Japanese PlayStation 1 games, like the 3 Dragon Ball games that came out on PS1. And that's when I started learning about what mod chips are and things like that. Because I met this kid who had this game called Thrill Kill, which was an unreleased game on PS1. And some of you know about this game already, and we played it, and I was like, wow, like, how'd you get this to work? And he taught me all about mod chips, how you can mod your system to play pirated games. You basically go to Blockbuster, and you rent Resident Evil or whatever game you want to burn. You burn it with your CD burner, which at the time was new, and then you could play it without having to pay for it. Now, you have to understand, when I was a kid, I was poor. And as a result of that, seeing the ability to get something for free and play it was a big deal. Nowadays, because I have a job and a career, I'm always for supporting the official version. So, go out there and buy your games and enjoy them, because at least your money's going to a studio that worked hard on the game. That's been my perspective. But back then as a kid, I could never have dreamed of having access to a whole library of video games and not even worry about paying them. So like the early mod sites, I remember, there was one called EMU Paradise, I think. I might still be up, I have no idea. And I remember downloading a bunch of ROMs, and in those days, I didn't have internet at home. I had a home computer that my older brother built for me, and it was an old Pentium. This is like back in the 90s, yo. This is not like what we have now. But you could fit one, maybe 2 ROMs on a floppy disk. So what I would do is I would go to school, I would go to the public library next to my school, I would download the ROM of whatever game I wanted onto the floppy disk, take it home, load up the floppy disk, and that's how I was able to play these ROMs. There are so many games that I did not own that I was able to play because of ROMs. Games like Super Metroid and Chrono Trigger. I didn't get to play those till I had ROMs. And the reason for that's because, like I told you, we were broke, and I wasn't going to ask my parents to go find Super Nintendo games when I was already playing PS1. It was becoming harder and harder to find these games in stores. You had to go to more so like game stores, not really like Walmart. At that point, that generation had kind of faded away. But you have to imagine, being a kid, you're like, wow, like I can finally play these games. And there were so many games like Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore, that I got to play with ROMs. In fact, I remember sometime in 2000, I don't remember exactly what month, I got my hands on an early copy of Pokemon Gold. This is before it even came to America. This was like months before it came to America. And the game was half translated. So the first half of the game was in English, but they used like the Japanese names for the Pokemon. Like Cyndaquil was named Hinoarashi or whatever. I remember that. And this is before I even knew what a Cyndaquil was. And so I remember playing this game, half translated, and then when you get to the game halfway through, it starts to glitch out. When you beat, I think, the fifth or sixth gym leader, it began to like glitch out and go into Japanese text, and I didn't know what the hell to do after that. I was lost. I remember looking up a game facts on how to do it, but it was just so cool back then, like being able to play these ROMs. And nowadays, like everything I play, I pretty much own. Like if I play Final Fantasy VI on stream, I own that game. Not only do I own that game like normally, but I own the Japanese Super Famicom version of that game. So if you own the game and you're using a ROM to play, that's not even a big deal because you already own the game, right? It's legal. But the issue is, do you own the games that you're playing that that maybe you don't own them? That's a different story. But back in those days, I didn't own anything because I didn't have any money. I mean, we were broke, like I said. So there were so many, like, it was such an era of discovery for me because there were so many games that we never had access to, including the big one. The big one was Final Fantasy V, because you have to understand, Final Fantasy V had not been translated for America. Final Fantasy V on Super Famicom, before they re-released it on PS1 in the Final Fantasy Collection 5 and 6, before that, you couldn't play that game. And I have magazines, video game magazines that were around back then that were discussing, hey, Final Fantasy V is coming. I even have one issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly where they even said that Final Fantasy V will not be coming to America because they feel the game's too hard for Americans, which is complete freaking BS. That game is not even that hard at all. But they felt it was too challenging for Americans. So I got to play that game translated. One of the earliest translation ROMs I ever played was that one, yo. I mean, this is back in the day when Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were called 2 and 3 instead of 4 and 6. Now we know them as 4 and 6. But Final Fantasy V was one of many games. Later on, I had to play Dragon Quest 3, the Super NES version, not the Nintendo one. I got to play tons of other fan-translated games. And a lot of times, it's not like I'm not willing to pay for the game. We just didn't have access to it. And I speak for a whole generation of us. Like, Nintendo and NX and Square and whoever just did not translate these games, so we didn't have them. So all we could do is play the ROMs. That's all we can do. Importing games at the time, when you're like 16, 15 years old, it's difficult to tell your parents, I want to buy a game from Japan, and then when you get the game, you don't even understand it. You know, it's tough. Now, there are some games that are obviously in English that are on Super Famicom, or there are some games you can play where you don't even need a translation because the games don't require one. Like, for example, the Twin Bee games. The Twin Bee games are in Japanese, but there's very few Japanese text on there. It's a shooting game, so you don't need a translation for that, right? It's not a big deal. But, you know, there were so many games at the time that didn't have translation patches, and then there's some that did, and so we would play those. I just remember playing these games with a keyboard. You have no idea how difficult it is to play Super Mario Brothers with a keyboard. It's tough. So mostly what I played back then was JRPGs, because if you're playing a turn-based RPG, you don't really need the you don't really need a controller, because even though a keyboard is uncomfortable, because it's turn-based, you're able to take your time and select commands and whatnot. Whereas with platforming games or fighting games, it's very difficult to pull off a half-circle motion, much less one of those complicated SNK fighting game motions on a keyboard. It's really difficult. At least it was for me. I know some kids nowadays that play like NBA 2K on a keyboard. I don't know how the hell they do that. I can't do that. I've never been skilled at that. I'm more of a controller guy when it comes to games like that. When it comes to RPGs, though, it didn't matter. So I spent a lot of time playing those games. Plus, a lot of these games, you couldn't even find them like normally. Like, you couldn't even find them in stores anymore because, like I said, the SNES lifespan was over. And some of these games were already like sort of hard to find anyways. Like, for example, Dragon Warrior 3 and 4 on NES at one time were very difficult to find. They're still hard to find now, but they didn't make that many copies of those games. And so because of that, you know, when it comes to the world of ROMs, like in those days, you know, we were able to do that and it was fine. It was fine. That's the only way we could do it. But it opened up a whole new world of opportunities because we can play games that we had previously not had access to that we couldn't afford. You know, nowadays, playing retro games is so much easier because Nintendo is always putting up retro games on their, not just the virtual store, the virtual console or whatever, but also on their on the Nintendo and Super Nintendo apps on the Switch. So you got tons of retro games there. Not to mention PlayStation 4 or Sony sometimes has games you can download, and there's also all kinds of collections that come out. Sega put out a collection, SNK, Atari. So we now have access to these games a lot easier than we did back then. But I just remember the work we had to do because I remember one time I had like 10 floppy disks, and I would load them up with ROMs. And I would download them from the public school library because they didn't care. And it was just such a great era of discovery. You know what I mean? And the cool thing about ROMs too is they also served as like demos. So you could play a game with a ROM, and if you liked it, you could go out and buy it. I did that for several PS1 games later on, of course, where I would play like a ROM, even though I had demos of some of these games. Okay, I like them, I'm gonna go buy it. Some people just wouldn't buy it; they would just play the ROM. Screw it, I already got the game. But not me. I always wanted to be honorable. And then you could do that. Like, you could play a game. Oh, well, this game looked good in the magazines with the pictures and the description, but I'm not really feeling it. There's tons of games like that where I was really looking forward to playing them, and they wound up being trash. For example, a lot of the Atari Jaguar games, like Kasumi Ninja. Dude, this is a freaking awesome, freaking violent, bloody game, fatalities and all. I was into Mortal Kombat, and then you play the game and it's complete garbage. Like, there were tons of games like that. There was a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers game on Sega CD that was like that. And so it's just funny because, like, that era, the idea of being able to take, and what's crazy is that when it comes to emulation, you could take the entire, like, NES library, every NES game, and put them together, and it still wouldn't be as big as one PS4 game now. And that's crazy, because these are full games. And we're talking about, even like with all the different versions and beta copies and all that, there were tons of them. I mentioned Final Fantasy V, but also I remember playing the fan translations of Final Fantasy 2 and 3, which also never came to America. And I'm not talking about 4 or 6, I mean the original 2 and 3, from Nintendo, from NES, Famicom, got to play that. RPGs was a big deal back then. So let me know in the comments your memories of emulation and ROMs, and kind of like, just curious about your thoughts on all that, and how, just, your history. Did you do this when you were younger? Like, how do you feel about it? I'd love to know. Because I love stories about that era, because man, that era before the internet, when the internet was young. This is like the early days of the internet, before nowadays where everything's huge and big. There's a billion websites, a billion social media platforms. That era, I have a lot of nostalgia for it, because it really was like stepping into a whole new world. Nowadays, kids are born on the internet. Back then, we had to discover it. So let me know, and we'll talk soon.